Almost a quarter of the 2021 Motul FIM Superbike World Championship will take place in Spain, but this weekend becomes the first country to reach 7 different host venues for the discipline. 2 weeks on from leaving Most, it's unfamiliar territory again for the first Pirelli Navarra round. The final race action of the weekend coming up in just under half an hour's time. You join us from the 3.9-kilometre Circuito de Navarra, the shortest circuit on the calendar and probably the most technical. Unusually, at least 6 of the 15 corners require first gear, and as we saw yesterday, overtaking on the short stretches between most of the corners is a real challenge. So it's the longest straights that provide the best overtaking opportunities. If you can't make it through at the high-speed turn 1, then the next real opportunity is turn 9. Top speed down the back straight, at least 240 kilometres per hour, the longest braking zone on the circuit, before the riders drop to 70 at the apex. After that, the focus is on the end of the lap, the short squirts into turns 13 and 15, an opportunity for the bold. Hot pace set in the Superpole race earlier on here today. We expect something more akin to race 1 this afternoon. Good afternoon then, and welcome back to sunny Spain for race 2 of the Pirelli Navarra round. Now, race 1 was a pretty sedate affair over 23 laps, at least for spectators, some of the riders getting a rougher ride. But that's the great thing about the Motul FIM Superbike World Championship. We get to do it twice per weekend. Steve English alongside me. We're hoping for a very different race to yesterday, but are we going to get it?
I think we can hope for a very different race. Whether or not we get it is a very different story, and the main reason for that is, even though we had a really interesting Superpole race this morning, the feature-length race over 23 laps is a very different battle. Scott Redding looks like he's got an edge this weekend, but it can all change depending on who's able to get in the fight with him, and certainly we saw a good fight at the front from Jonathan Rea in the 10-lap race, but overall this weekend it has seemed that the Kawasaki's been at a little bit of a disadvantage.
Yeah, real entertainment in the Superpole race, particularly the first half of the Superpole race, as all 3 of our championship contenders were really in the mix, but they've got a bit of an advantage over the rest of the pack behind them.
Yeah, all 3 of our championship contenders, because Toprak Razgadioglu's been on the podium in both races so far this weekend, but he just hasn't quite had that edge compared to even Jonathan Rea, and then obviously Scott Redding. Redding, just like in Most, he's had that advantage in terms of outright pace. He's been able to put it to good use by picking up race victories in the first 2 races of this weekend, and he's going to try and make it his first ever World SBK treble.
Yes, fighting between Scott Redding and Jonathan Rea in the early running opened the door to Toprak Razgatlioglu to lead at one stage of the Superpole race, but he didn't have the pace. 3 seconds down on Redding at the checkered flag in 3rd position. Redding victorious, narrows his championship deficit to 42 points to Jonathan Rea, the series leader. Back-to-back second places for Rea. A separate fight further down the order for 4th position. And as we said, the riders finishing just as they did in race number 1, which means that Andrea Locatelli, Alex Lowes and Tom Sykes will line up on row 2. Chaz Davies, his first scoring finish of the weekend, takes 7th place ahead of Michael van der Mark and Garrett Gerloff. Riders to miss out include Michael Ruben Rinaldi, who, Steve, will start all the way down in 13th position here. Yeah,
Rinaldi's been off the pace all the way through this weekend. It's been a tough one for him, and it's a weekend where he is under pressure, considering the news that came out that Scott Redding was going to leave Ducati, and the near certainty that Alvaro Bautista is going to replace him at Ducati. So suddenly Rinaldi is a name that's been talked about by an awful lot of people, and whenever you have a bad weekend like he's had so far, it does mean that you really need to bounce back, get yourself into the top 10 in this race.
Yes, plenty of movement in the rider market. As we've said previously, this is the halfway point in our 2021 campaign, so teams that hadn't fixed themselves up earlier on are starting to shuffle those pieces right now, and it does look as though it's Honda with the most work to do as far as settling on their 2022 riders, because it does appear just pending official confirmation now really is the last thing missing for any confirmation as to Alvaro Bautista rejoining Ducati, replacing the rider that replaced him, of course. Unusual cosmic justice in the Superbike World Championship paddock as Scott Redding moves on to BMW machinery. That is confirmed for 2022.
Yeah, Redding making the move for next season, and I think before anyone gets too hung up on any of the details, you have to remember how many riders willingly give up the kind of bike that Redding's on right now to go to a machine that is waiting to make that step to be proven to be a title contender. So for Scott Redding, it's certainly a new future, a new opportunity, but you'd have to wonder whether or not it was the first choice that he would have wanted to make.
Well, he could potentially still do it as world champion, of course, certainly based on the evidence of what we've seen over the last 2.5 weekends.
Yeah, there could certainly be a #1 plate in the BMW next year, and Scott Redding, he's been able to close down that championship lead that Jonathan Rea has. It's down to 42 points now, and week on week over the course of the last few rounds, he's been able to edge himself closer to Jonathan Rea, and in this weekend he's had that clear advantage. You can see the overtaking move that he made in the Superpole race, pretty much a carbon copy of what he did in race 1 yesterday as well. But the difference was that over the course of the Superpole race, he had to battle it out with Rea all the way through the 10 laps. Over the course of 23 laps, he seems like he's just got that little bit more of an edge.
Jonathan Rea was so aggressive and determined during that Superpole race earlier on today. Highly entertaining and great to see. He also had pace on the final lap of 10, and that's going to give him some heart, isn't it, ahead of the longer race here? Yeah,
well, for Jonathan Rea, I think the biggest challenge he's going to have is just maintaining that consistency all the way through the race. We saw that he was right on the limit at times during the 10-lap race. A little bit easier to be on that limit for 10 laps than it is for 23 laps. We saw yesterday he overstepped the mark on a couple of occasions. He had one massive save down at turn 9. He ran off the track on another occasion at turn 9. So it hasn't been easy for Rea.
But this has been a more typical Jonathan Rea ride in the sense that when he hasn't been able to take the maximum points, he's got the next best thing, which is 20 championship points in the case of race 1 here yesterday.
Yeah, and that's all you can do whenever you turn up at a round like this where you're clearly at a disadvantage. The Kawasaki isn't the easiest bike to ride around this track, and certainly for Jonathan Rea, he's been able to do a good job to maximise his potential around here. But I think it's also worth keeping an eye on that bike all the way through the race to see how it progresses. We've seen the bumps clearly impact him an awful lot more than some of the other bikes. We see that the Kawasaki maybe not quite as supple over those bumps as some of the other bikes. We see that there's an awful lot more visible motion on his bike compared to the Ducatis or the Yamahas, for instance.
So it's Jonathan Rea then who has got the defence of this title up and running. He is a leader, but only by 9 points. And the question really over the course of race 2 is also, can Toprak Razgatlioglu get on terms with Jonathan Rea? We haven't seen anyone able to match Scott Redding, but neither has Toprak been able to match Rea.
Yeah, and for Toprak, this has been a tougher weekend than I think we were expecting. I think for a lot of people, we kind of thought this would be a tough one for Kawasaki with the limitations that there are with the ZX-10 Aurora, but we thought that the Yamaha would be a little bit more competitive at the test. They were able to really hit the ground running here, set some very fast lap times, but it hasn't really transpired like that over the course of the weekend for Toprak so far. But that being said, Toprak's only given up 6 points to Jonathan Rea over the course of the weekend so far.
And as we pop into the Pata Yamaha pit box, they've got 2 of the men of the moment, really. Toprak Razgatlioglu clearly going after the championship leader, and Andrea Locatelli in a rich vein of form. But even so, they've just been that little step backwards, as you've just said. Yeah,
well, for Locatelli, he's moved himself up to 6th in the championship standings. He's now the 2nd Yamaha in the standings, and he's only a handful of points behind the likes of Michael Ruben Rinaldi, and then closing in on Alex Lowes as well. About 21 points back to Lowes. You can see there for Toprak, absolutely no fear for him of trying to make sure he's using the curbs on the entry to that corner as well, trying to go around the outside of, I think it was Yuramoto down into turn 9 there. But Toprak always with such total confidence in the front end of that Yamaha, and that's why we haven't really seen too many mistakes from Toprak. When you think about this season as a whole, obviously the Assen crash with Garrett Gerloff is the headline grabber for missed opportunities for Toprak, but other than that, he's been really consistent all the way through this season, doesn't make mistakes, and that's why Jonathan Rea's been under pressure all the way through this year.
Well, the FIM doesn't have a motor-powered unicycle competition as yet in the ranks, but if they did, you'd certainly bet on Toprak, wouldn't you, with those kind of manoeuvres?
I think Toprak's always going to be a pretty safe bet for that honour, and we see him obviously one of the most spectacular riders in the world, but it's how manageable he makes that as well. He doesn't make those mistakes that we saw from other riders up against Jonathan Rea in the past.
Now, we've got to discuss Tom Sykes, because there's been a lot of talk about him this weekend. When Scott Redding was confirmed for BMW for next season, BMW said Tom Sykes was still under consideration, that discussions were still ongoing behind the scenes about keeping Sykes within the BMW fold on a satellite bike, effectively, although BMW were keen to avoid the use of that particular word, saying that it would be on equal machinery. But it doesn't sound from Tom Sykes' side as though he's particularly sure that that's something that's going to happen.
Yeah, I was talking to Tom on Friday for an interview, and I asked him about that communication between BMW, and he said the communication's been a little bit lacking, and then as the weekend's transpired, he's been in interviews in the media and on TV where he's also doubled down on those comments. So clearly for Tom Sykes, a rider that looks after his own affairs, he's been kept out of the loop a little bit, it seems. So the press release, and obviously it wouldn't be too typical for a press release to gloss over some of the finer details, but certainly for Tom Sykes, he's been pretty clear on the matter that he hasn't had discussions with BMW for next year. But the big rumour around the paddock today and over the course of this week was that he might well have been having a few chats with Leon Camier at Honda.
Yes, the typical situation when we get to this sort of time of year is everyone suddenly becomes a bird watcher and the binoculars are out, and which manager's going where. With Tom Sykes, we don't have to watch out for managers, we just follow the number 66 himself.
Yeah, Twitters and tweeters, and certainly for Tom Sykes, when he looks after his own affairs, if he goes in for a cup of coffee with another manufacturer, suddenly it starts the tongues wagging, which is exactly what he needs. He needs a little bit of interest, bit of column inches to try and generate some interest in his signing for next season. He's actually done a really good job so far this season. He's up there 8th in the World Championship. He's ahead of Michael van der Mark, his teammate, by 11 points, and he's actually made a big step forward in terms of being able to manage the races. The changes that we've seen to Pirelli tyres over the last few years have helped Tom to not have that drop-off in performance that we saw at times a few years ago, and suddenly he's been able to keep himself into those top 10 spots, which, to be honest, with the BMW is about what you have to try and do right now. They are at that disadvantage compared to the leading three manufacturers. A few weekends they're going to be really strong and give themselves an opportunity to have good results. Tom's done that with front row starts and podiums at the Donington round as well.
And without trying to sort of put two and two together, Honda are the only factory team really with rides still available. There's a couple that aren't officially confirmed but look 99% sure.
Yeah, and you'd have to say, looking at it, that Tom Sykes, Chaz Davis, two riders that would be very experienced hands of riding different manufacturers and working with different teams, would be two riders right up at the top of the shopping list for Honda. Obviously, for Chaz Davis in particular, he's always been one of his best friends has always been Leon Camier, the team manager for Honda. Is that something that they'd be wanting to mix? That remains to be seen. But certainly for Honda, they could have either a world champion in the form of Tom Sykes or a former Supersport world champion in the hands of Chaz Davis, and then try and bring through a young rider from Moto2 or from the Grand Prix paddock. And obviously there have been some riders from MotoGP being linked with Superbike rides, whether that's Petrucci, Iker Lecuona, or in the Moto2 class the likes of Javi Vierge. So could be interesting to see if one of those is an option alongside an experienced hand.
That's probably enough in terms of signing news, but as always we have our ears to the ground and we'll try and pick things up ASAP. Back to this race, mentioned the same top six in the opening two races so far this weekend. Are we going to see the same top six again? Surely not.
Well, I think it's going to be a big challenge to see the same top six, because you'd expect that Chaz Davis is going to get in the fight. Michael van der Mark always does well in the longer races as well, so he should be able to get in there. Garrett Gerloff's coming from the third row of the grid, but we haven't really seen much from Gerloff so far this weekend. Very reticent when he's out on track alongside any other riders. Needs to dial back that aggression that we saw earlier in the season and give himself the chance of making some moves. We saw even at the end of the Superpole race, he had the opportunity to get through on van der Mark, and Mikey was able to ride around the outside of him to retain that position. So we didn't see that earlier in the season from Garrett Gerloff. So hopefully we're able to see him start to dial that back up and put the number 31 back up there, because we know how fast he is, we know how talented he is, and you want to see him at the front. You want to see him getting in amongst it with other riders.
It does feel unusual at this stage to be saying that we want to see a bit more aggression from Garrett Gerloff, doesn't it?
Well, it goes to show just the impact that a big incident like what happened in Assen can have on a rider. You know, we talk an awful lot at different times over the course of a season about the mentality of different riders and the mental approach that goes into racing. Garrett Gerloff is a good case study in that, because he's had to deal with almost every interview for the last couple of rounds basically centering around on the fact that he's had those big high profile incidents, and it's clearly worn down on him and had a big impact. So hopefully over the course of the next few rounds we really get to see Garrett just bring that back and get himself to the front. You want to see riders like that at the front of the field. He's an exciting rider to watch, and certainly whenever he's been battling at the front, he's always been a bit of box office.
Yes, and we'll see what Garrett Gerloff can do from the third row of the grid. 23 laps for him to try and make his way up through the field, and hopefully we get to see some of his customary fight early on. As for riders further back down the order to mention, Alvaro Bautista top qualifying Honda in 12th position, and Michael Ruben Rinaldi down in 13th. There is Scott Redding. He is your pole sitter, Reading 2 wins out of 2. And looking to take what would be his first treble in a single weekend.
Yeah, and for Reading, this is the first time he's won 3 in a row, so trying to make that 4 and really just to complete a very strong 3 series of rounds as well. Assen, Most, and now this weekend he's been really quick, really consistent, hasn't made mistakes, and that's why he's been able to close down that championship lead. He definitely starts today's race as your clear-cut favourite, given how the weekend's gone so far.
Yes, he is the highest scorer in the Superbike paddock over the last 9 races. That's why he's been able to pull in a gap that I think was 77 points to Jonathan Rea at one stage, and it's now just 42.
Yeah, and the big blot in his copybook, Donington Park, that really tough weekend in his home round, and from that point onwards, he's been able to recover really well. But for Scott Redding, it is a long season, and you have to remember that it's not won and lost on one round, it's won and lost over the course of the full 13 rounds, and Redding doing what he can to start building that momentum once again.
Yes, he's down on 2021 podiums compared to Jonathan Rea and Toprak Razgatlioglu, and frankly, that's why he trails them. A couple of nods, excuse the pun, to the San Fermin festival held here in Navarra through the summer, and certainly great to have a bit of local flavour over the course of the weekend, and thankfully they won't be doing any chasing of small children either. You'll have to come to the festival next year if you want to see more of that. But back with the Superbike grid itself, a reminder, the front row of the grid with Scott Redding, Jonathan Rea and Toprak Razgatlioglu. They are your top 3 in the championship standings. This is Jonathan Rea, who sits P2. Look at that consistency. Just those 2 incidents for Rea. 2 second places this weekend so far. And Jonathan Rea will be going all out for a race victory here. I think we can hear from Rea himself.
Thanks, Alex. Johnny, you've been saying in these conditions all weekend, the front, you've been having trouble with the front, especially when the temperature rises. Similar conditions now, have you been able to work on that, and how do you feel going into this?
Yeah, we changed the bike quite a lot overnight from wheelbase point of view, front character of the chassis, and I felt like we made some inroads in that Super Pole race, especially at the end. I just felt a little bit better on the front than I did yesterday, so let's see. I think that's going to be the deciding factor in the race, is the front grip, not the rear, so excited to see what I can do.
Best of luck, Johnny.
Cheers, man.
Just saw Scott Redding there collecting the watch for the Super Pole race victory. Now, we haven't had too many different winners of Tissot watches this season because Jonathan Rea has nicked them all in the Super Pole sessions, hasn't been beaten as yet, and only a couple of Super Pole races have gone against them as well. Completing the front row of the grid, Toprak Razgatlioglu, 2 third places for him, a little bit closer perhaps in the Super Pole race earlier on today, but just didn't have the pace in race 1 here yesterday.
Yeah, it was a struggle for Toprak yesterday, and after what we'd seen in the free practice sessions, we expected the Yamahas were going to be a bit closer to the front. We saw Toprak, Locatelli and Gerloff all up inside the top 5 on Friday, and in the free practice session for Saturday morning we also saw them competitive.
Second row of the grid, Andrea Locatelli, Alex Lowes and Tom Sykes. Look at that upsurge in form from Andrea Locatelli. Great graph indication. Early stage of the season, knocking around on the fringes of the top 10 in his debut campaign, of course, in the Superbike World Championship as the reigning Super Sport champion. 2 fourth places this weekend so far.
Yeah, 2 fourth places this weekend. Worth remembering as well, at Assen he was relegated from what would have been his first podium after just exceeding the track limits at the chicane at the end of the race. So certainly for Locatelli, he's made that step forward. A bit like Scott Redding, over the last 3 rounds, he's been one of those more consistent riders, done a really good job.
Yes, so it's 2 podium finishes for Andrea Locatelli since Assen. That could have been 3, of course. Alongside him here, Alex Lowes lining up from P5. Lowes was involved in a race-long struggle with Andrea Locatelli in the Super Pole race earlier on today. Almost got through at one stage, but couldn't get through for 4th position in the end. Yeah,
we saw him make the move on Locatelli at one stage, but then the Yamaha just had that little bit more grip underneath him, was able to get himself through and hold on to that 4th spot. But 2 5th place finishes so far for Lowes. Good start to the weekend.
Completing the second row is Tom Sykes, 2 6th places in a row. He's still got to prove his point for the remainder of this season until he is officially confirmed on the dotted line for a team for 2022.
Yeah, I always think it's easy to forget just how good Tom Sykes was at different times during his career. Could easily have won 3 World Superbike titles. So he is a rider that when everything's on form for him, gives a team that opportunity to have a lot of success. So with a bit of luck, we're still going to see him on a good bike next season.
Yes, Tom Sykes, 17 consecutive races in the points, has actually completed more laps than anyone else on the Superbike grid this season. He's generally avoided retirement, so Sykes a consistent man, and that's about as much of a CV as I'm going to post on behalf of Tom Sykes. Third row of the grid, Chaz Davies, Michael van der Mark and Garrett Gerloff. Davies there lining up at P7, didn't extract maximum potential from his joint best Superpole session of this season so far, qualified P5 in Superpole